Yes, I was here in the late 70s. Alessandra's trying to help me figure out the date and the place, but it was one of the early World Systems meetings, and one of my heroes, Giovanni Arrighi, that's where I met him. And I think I'd already met Wallerstein, but all these famous people, and I was just a young thing. I was a postdoc. So it's wonderful to be back. Now, Alessandra and the others have set me a task, which has been a big challenge. And she's correct in the wonderful article you've written on labor in food regime context, that it has been ignored. That Bonanno and Cavalcanti had pointed that out. It's true. And that meant it was a real challenge for me to try to think it. And what I have done, and it's very, very preliminary, so I'll raise it as a set of questions, is I've done two things. One is to try to raise the question of citizenship and legal status as historically in the context of food regimes. And then it turns out Canada was very important within the British Empire in that history. And so it gives me a kind of thread to follow, a continuity, to talk about migrant labor in Canada and how labor has changed in North America, the US as a declining hegemon, the rise of new complexes, particularly fruits and vegetables, shift of power in the state system and capital. But this is where I'll bring capital in. In the history of citizenship, it's really about the beginnings of food regime theory. So I'll start now. I'll remind you that for those of you who've read some food regime theory, that the original article in 1989 by Philip McMichael and me was entitled Agriculture and the State System. Right? It was not, capital was part of it. Currencies, the gold standard under the British regime, the dollar, Bretton Woods system under the US regime, things like that, as Arrighi, I think it was, helped me learn that military and monetary rules are central to any hegemony. So those were there as a frame for capital, and that remains so. So the politics and the state-to-state relations are perhaps worthy of foregrounding, of bringing forward as a frame for capital accumulation as well as for labor. So I'm going to talk about citizenship. First, I'll go a little about agriculture in the state system. It was about a shift from imperial blocks. That was the name I gave it. These were two articles I wrote in 1990 and 1991, and it's really interesting to go back now to that. So in studies in political economy, and I wrote an article called New Wines, New Bottles, Regulation of Capital on a World Scale, in which I named imperial blocks as a framework for capital mainly. So now I'm trying to rethink it in terms of citizenship and labor and control over borders, the movement of people rather than capital across borders, and in fact the emergence of those borders themselves. So in 1989, what McMichael and I were doing was describing a shift from imperial blocks to national states. We focused mainly on the economic frame. So John Stuart Mill, for instance, described, even in the 18th century, he treated the colonies of England as part of we would now call it national economy. Of course he didn't call it that. He called it just part of England's economy. The sugar that came from the Caribbean and so on. And this continued, I'll just add, until during World War II. Raymond Aron, socialist, during World War II, was writing about post-war plans and that of course included, that's another story, but included plans to regulate food internationally, plans which were, as some of you may know, sidelines. They were refused by the US and Britain in 1947. But during that period, the idea, during the war, the idea that state planning was going to help create a new world and that food was central to it, included the colonies of France, outre-mer, right? Sugar was part of French national planning. The idea that colonies would become independent was not on the horizon yet. So it's important to kind of recover, to attempt to recover the framework for thinking about states and power and authority and borders. And I had another article for those who want to follow this. I can send the references in review, which is the Journal of the Fernand Braudel Center, World Systems, Rethinking Capitalism and Hierarchy, where I focused again on this, the importance of the state system. Then I let it go in 1991, mostly, and moved on to mainly ecology, and I will return to that at the end of this talk and talk more about it tomorrow. So if we rethink legal controls in this framework, that is the shift from imperial blocks to national state sovereignty, how did that happen? When did it happen? And how can we think about it in terms of control over the movement of labor across borders, and therefore the use of citizenship as a means of regulating labor? Well, always the settler states were different, and what McMichael and I were arguing in the original piece was that what was unique about the US was that it combined these agricultural outposts, colonial outposts of Britain or France, combined them inside the territory of the United States. And it created the idea of what we called a national economy, that it became the basis for the idea of development as a balanced national economy, one that was contained within the borders of the national state, so that newly independent colonies would take on this idea, and it's still with us. So, where did all this come from? It turns out that control over labor was very important to this shift. And I've discovered it mainly through the work of two Canadian theorists, Nandita Sharma. They're both from York University, or at least were when they wrote these articles. Nandita Sharma had written the first work I knew about the Canadian immigrant state-to-state arrangements for migrant agricultural labor, mainly in Ontario. I looked for her work. Where has she gone since she wrote this book, a wonderful book called Home Economics? I came through her, I came to the work I'm going to use a lot in this part of the talk by Radhika Manja, M-O-N-G-I-A. I'm happy to give these references to anyone. It's from Comparative Studies in Society and History in 2007, and it's called Historicizing State Sovereignty, Inequality in the Form of Equivalence. And I'm not going to talk about that form of equivalence because really it's her historical analysis rather than her conceptual one that's interesting for the question of labor. What she argues is that we have to do something like what Phil McMichael calls incorporated comparison. She has a different name for it, but it's a holistic view that instead of comparing cases, we have to look at the origin of those cases, the genealogy of national states, for instance. We can't just treat them and read them backwards as if they always existed. So we have to be able to look at the emergence of the units themselves in our historical analysis. That's what she means by historicizing state sovereignty. Where did state sovereignty come from? So she argues, now she's doing a genealogy of sovereign state control over the movement of people across borders. And she says that the genealogy was colonial. We have to understand that national states grew up within the context of an imperial organization of the world. So, of course, I'm looking at the British Empire, and one would have to do a separate analysis of what happened in the French Empire, or how much of world history was influenced by the ultimate dominance of the British Empire. So I don't know the answer to those questions, but looking inside the British Empire, there were two crucial events, legal. How did they define sovereignty? And the crucial shift was from the sovereignty of the subject, of the person, which meant freedom to move. Sovereignty of the subject within empire. Anyone can move within the empire. To sovereignty of the national state, which meant the emergence itself of the national state, which Britain in a way still isn't, right? It's retained certain elements of its imperial structure. So the genealogy came in Manja's analysis through two crucial legal disputes, and the language that was used in those disputes endured even when it was not accepted at the time. So we have, okay, the first one was 1835. Now slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834. It was abolished in the world as far as they were concerned, and certainly in the empire. That meant it was abolished in Mauritius, and that's where the argument began, because everywhere in the British Empire, including the Caribbean, where slavery was abolished, there was a rapid movement to bring Indian indentured workers to replace the slaves, okay, the African slaves. Now we have a problem. Who decides, is there any control here? What we have are labor recruiters, not that different from today, who are going around India in certain areas and recruiting people by whatever means, right? Whatever promises, threats, tricks, to come and work in the colonies to replace the slaves. Now, there began a dispute. First, it began in India, where the Governor General, he's part of the British government, British Imperial government, but the Governor General of India decides that there is a problem here and that there might be some abuse of the Indians being recruited, and he wants to create certain controls over that and to protect Indians, because it's very racialized, right? Because they're not able to take care of themselves, basically. They're easily tricked, unlike others. And then the Governor General of Mauritius wanted to control who came in and made humanitarian arguments. No one's making racial arguments exactly. Well, this thing about Indians being not able to protect themselves go in that direction. Many things go in that direction, but no one will say it explicitly, ever. He's claiming humanitarian grounds, not for the Indians, but for the people already in Mauritius. And he wants to be sure that the order of society is maintained and no bad elements will come in from India that will create problems. Right? So, and he also wants the Indians who come, they want Indians to come. They just want to be able to select who comes and control. And they also want those Indians to be of good character, meaning that they're good workers and responsible, honest, all of those things, so they can create a good example for the newly freed slaves who are still in Mauritius, and we don't know how they're going to act, right? Governor General. So that's the first one, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment. The second one happened much later, in the early 20th century, just in the years before the First World War, and it happened in Canada. And this was a famous story, but I hadn't connected it, so I learned a lot going through this. A group of Sikhs, Punjab, from Punjab, came to Vancouver on a boat. They couldn't come directly, because there weren't any boats directly from India. They had to come via Hong Kong or some other port. They did come via Hong Kong. And it created a very big crisis. And there they had a lot more trouble suppressing the racial elements of the intention to refuse entry or to restrict entry to these Sikh immigrants. The most important thing from this point of view was that the language they used, there was no precedent to refuse entry in British law, and they were all trying to work that through the law. They made a first claim to national sovereignty as a right to control immigration, who comes in. Now passports, even the existence of passports, become an important part of this story because they didn't exist before all of this. And it was rejected, so it was a claim to national sovereignty, the ability of the government of Canada, which had achieved a certain independence in 1867, that was the legal status, but still in 1905, I think it was, 1909, these immigrants that I have up on the screen here, this is taken from the article by Manja. They were escaping. It was a complex thing from the port. The government of Canada was declaring its national sovereignty, and it was refused by the British government until after World War I had begun, and that's when the national security argument also came first into play. So we have a settler colony, right, of Britain, being the first within the British Empire to claim the right to control migration successfully, and only in the 20th century, and only in the context of World War. Now, remember, the Sikhs were an important part of the British Imperial Army in World War I, too, and they were also recruiting more European settlers at the same time. Oops. Oh my goodness, I've lost? No, okay, there we go. So, the shift from imperial to national blocks happened, therefore, as a shift from the sovereignty of the subject, that is, the right of anyone to move freely, who is a subject of the British Empire, to the rights of nations to national sovereignty, that is, even the construction of the nation, is very deeply implicated in the right of this entity to control its borders with respect to the movement of people. The only exceptions that, I think she's a very careful researcher, the only exceptions she found were that the British government controlled a little bit, not perfectly, controlled the entry of French after the French Revolution, people they called Jacobins. But they did that in 1795, but that was the language that was used for that was, and the legal precedents were related to war. So what do you do during war about the movement of people? Not normal peacetime and labor. So the important one was the shift in the movement of workers within the empire, between colonies from India to Mauritius. So then the second thing to say about Canada is that the question of national security was framed not in terms of an enemy, of a political enemy, but in terms of order and employment. The claim was, that the allowing of Sikhs in was going to cause or make worse the situation of unemployment. However, at the same moment, the government of Canada had contracted with the Salvation Army to recruit European immigrants because there was a shortage of labor. So there you go. So I'm going to shift now to talk about agriculture and food regimes, and point out first that most of the movement of people to the settler colonies, almost all of it, was from England or other countries in Europe to become farmers. So it wasn't laborers in the 19th century. Now earlier, Europeans had come as indentured workers as well. That was an extremely common practice. That meant they came and had a contract usually for 7 years, were bound to their employer. They were assistants on farms, and they had to buy their freedom and earn it through working for that amount of time. They often had to pay their passage on the ships, repay. So they came indebted and bonded. But by the 19th century, the late 19th century, when we talk about the first food regime, that was not so common. Mostly they were coming as settlers, and the vast territories opened up for the creation of the wheat and cattle sectors required free settlers, and they required really household labor, and there was a massive shortage of labor to settle these territories that were organized around the railways. Now, of course, they were evicting. Every time you bring people in, you're getting rid of somebody else or replacing somebody else. So I will return to the question of the indigenous people displaced by force, violently displaced. We can talk about some of the rebellions of the indigenous people, if you like, afterwards. But now I'm just going to remind you that it happened, or recall that it happened, and then talk a little about how household labor worked among Europeans on settler farms. These were all migrants, and migrants within the pre-imperial system. In particular, there's a wonderful book I can recommend by Marjorie Cohen called Women and Work in 19th Century Ontario. That's not the exact title, but it's something like that. And there she talks about, first, the relations between men and women and generations in household labor, parents and children. But particularly property, which was owned by men, but also, most importantly, the division of labor, and how the shift from a simple commodity production to an industrial food system happened, particularly in the dairy sector, which was one of the first ones where it happened, and how the shift in gender took place. So this is important in the construction of a working class out of a settler agriculture, and a working class that is in the food sector, but an early phase of the change of the food sector from agriculture to manufacturing. And now, we still have as many people employed in the food system as ever. It's just that most of them now work in manufacturing or services, in supermarkets or fast food or restaurants, and in food manufacturing. They work for Nestle's or whatever. So it's important whenever we talk about the decline of the agricultural population to remember that the food system still employs all those people. So this was an early phase in that, with the creation of dairy industries. Dairy was the job of women. And on Ontario farms, you could only farm part of the year, and the rest of the year it was pretty frozen. The world was pretty frozen, and it was full of forests in need of being cut down, which meant the men would go and work in lumber, in timbering, and they would get the logs down the frozen rivers to get them out. Women stayed on the farm all the time and kept the animals and were making the cheese and the butter. for the cities that were beginning to emerge. We're talking about the 1850s and 1860s now. And and they were developing technology, and the local government was helping them develop technology to improve their dairying and to increase the scale by cooperatives, by cooperation. However, that isn't what happened in the end. There were industries that employed the women temporarily as wage workers because they knew how to make butter and cheese, so long as they could train the men who would then become the laborers in the dairy industry. So there was a shift to manufacturing and a removal of a source of independence and money for women with the shift of dairy out of simple commodity or household production. Second point that's important perhaps to have as context is that racial differences did not affect the right to move within the empire. So the people coming into Canada from the early to the late 19th century, there was a highly racialized group, and that was the Irish. They were Catholic, they were highly discriminated against, and they rarely became farmers. When the Irish came, they were only laborers and domestic servants. But they were allowed to move freely into Canada, as Ireland was arguably the original colony of England. It was treated that way, the land was taken away, they were marginalized. That's how the massive immigration from Ireland started, along with the famine was part of that story. So then if we shift, that's the first food regime from the point of view of Canada as a settler colony. And that happened within the imperial framework. Now that began to change, as Manja has explained, with World War I, and that was the beginning of the crisis of the food regime as well. That the world markets collapsed, the migration and settler system had to adapt, world markets fell, and the settlers were completely dependent on selling in those world markets. They were in debt for migrating. They were independent, they weren't workers, but they were household producers, but they were very caught from the beginning in having to sell on the world market. So with World War I and then the economic crisis of the 1920s, which began where wheat prices fell in 1925 before the stock market crashed in 1929. So the crisis began in agriculture very early, and it affected most of all these settlers who had come as part of creating a world market. So then that whole period was transitional, but I'm going to shift now to the national period, which began for the food regime strongly with the rise and acceptance of the US to become the new hegemon and the new rules. So is it worth repeating some of the new rules of the US system, or I don't know how familiar people are. It's worth going over it, probably, yeah. Okay, so during World War II, the two main allies, the US and the UK, and England, or Great Britain, developed a very organized way of providing food for the war effort. And that meant controlling industries, it meant many things, but it meant a lot of state control over what was happening in the food system. And within that framework, during the war, they made plans for a World Food Board. And World War II, among all the allies, was including the French resistance, probably the Italian, you have to tell me. The idea was that when the war was over, it would not have been fought for nothing, that there would be the four freedoms that Roosevelt defined. There would be social and economic rights as well as political rights, and that meant very much food. That food was going to be made available, and it was going to be part of state planning, and it was going to be part of international planning. So the Food and Agriculture Organization was created. It could have been the basis for this planning. There was a meeting in 1947 in Washington to create this World Food Board, but the US changed its mind. And so did Britain under the Labour government. Harold Wilson voted against it too, and the reason was that it was inconsistent with the US domestic farm support programs, which had been introduced in the 1930s. And they were done in a very peculiar way. When the British wanted to support their farmers, they paid them the difference between what they earned and what they thought the government thought they needed. That was called deficiency payments. That's a pretty rational way to do something. If you want to do it, you just do it, right? The US, no. We're not going to give farmers money, and it's a really interesting ideological and political question why that was so. But just to say that the fact, the system that was designed by the US was not to give the farmers money. This is going to sound very familiar to you because it got adopted by the Common Agricultural Policy and everybody else later. But it was a very unusual idea that you don't give people money because you want them to have more money than the market is giving them. What you do is you support the price in the market, right? And that by buying it, basically. By buying it. So you generate surpluses. If you think about it, surpluses can't exist in some ideal market, right? They'll just go away. But when the government's buying it, not only do they continue to exist, unless you destroy it, which is usually very unpopular, and some of that happens, mostly what it does is it keeps pushing the prices down. So if you want the farm income to be here, if the government wants the farm income to be here, and it was set in Congress every year, what they thought it should be relative to the industrial wage, you want it to be here, it's not, so you buy the grain or the cotton, or a few other products from the farmers, and now you have so much of it that the price keeps going down. So the gap between what you want the farmers to get and the price they really can get on something you might call a free market the gap is getting bigger all the time. There's a really big problem. They solved it by aid. Domestic food aid in the form of food stamps and distribution. That's how the US welfare system began and still is an important part of it. Foreign food aid, starting with the Marshall Plan in Europe and Japan, and then in a new form to the countries that were becoming independent from the European empires in the famous Public Law 480. So all of that is to say that in 1947, the US realized that its domestic farm programs required import controls. Here's the other thing to think about. If the US government is paying a higher price for wheat than anyone else in the world, everyone's going to want to sell their wheat to the US, which will have more and more and more, and the gap will get bigger and bigger and bigger. So they have to control imports, which they did, just like the Common Agricultural Policy did for wheat, not for other things. Well, not for some crucial things. That's another thing we can talk about. But the point here is that they needed import controls. They decided they couldn't have the World World Food Board, and they also decided in the next year that they could not have the International Trade Organization, which had been planned. There was a meeting in Havana, that was long before the Cuban Revolution. There was a meeting in Havana to establish the International Trade Organization, which was agreed, but it wasn't passed by the US Senate for the same reason. It would not be consistent with US domestic farm support programs, and there were a lot of farmers there, and they were an important part of the Democratic Party coalition that was in power. So that meant that this temporary thing, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, became permanent. And they made it permanent by also putting in a specific article. Trade agreements in those days were really short. I mean, they're really simple. Anybody could read them. You didn't have to be a lawyer. You can go online and read Article 11, of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and it's less than 1 page, big print, right? And what it says is that everything else in this agreement does not apply to agriculture. So it was made explicit. Meanwhile, inside the US, and you'll have to tell me how this worked in Europe, inside the US, every law that was passed with regard to labor, particularly minimum wages, said this doesn't apply to agriculture. Agricultural laborers don't get minimum wage or other rights that were passed. And it created a new form of migration control. As far as I know, this was the first. It was the US Bracero program with Mexico. It actually started during World War II, 1942, and it lasted until 1964, when the migrant labor could work on its own. It's another story. But it invented, as the hegemon in the world, right, it invented this other new thing. It had invented food aid along with the Bretton Woods system of money. It invented agriculture as a separate sector to which universal laws did not apply as the exception. And now it invented state-to-state relations, agreements for bringing workers temporarily with limited rights across the border and the requirement that they return. So it created the migrant labor system that we now have. So it ended in the U.S. Well, you know how it works, so I don't have to tell you. Basically, everything you know about state-to-state relations was in the Bracero program in some form. So it ended in the U.S. in 1964, but it was adopted or replicated during the crisis or transition by all other countries, including Europe, including the European Economic Community, which became the European Union. Now, it was also adopted in Canada, but I'm going to get to that in a moment. I'm going to first talk about, even though the Canadian program began in 1964, I think it was a coincidence that the US one ended, although maybe not, because it began with Jamaican workers, but it very quickly moved to Mexican workers too, so I don't know. That would be an important thing to look at from the point of view of Mexico, I think, especially. But before I do that, I want to talk about the transition, the crisis of the food regime dominated by the US, dominated by food aid, centered on wheat, inherited from the imperial UK-centered regime, and livestock, which became central to the industrialization of agriculture, much more than wheat had been during the US regime. And that affected Europe, of course. I'll do a little sidestep here. When the US gave Marshall aid to Europe, 40% of it was in food, feed, and fertilizers. Now, Europe was hungry, it needed food, but the feed and fertilizers part was an effort to use the aid to, and everyone agreed this was a good thing. There's nothing sinister in the sense that it was resisted, to modernize agriculture, meaning to industrialize it. And that meant separating grain production from animal production. It meant, and this is where it gets a little more self-interested, it meant using feeds off-farm to feed the industrial agriculture. And so the Common Agricultural Policy of 1957, it was agreed, the US agreed that it could do what the US did, which is support wheat domestically in a similar way, in a bigger way, because it was replacing imports. But it also agreed with the Common Agricultural Policy not to restrict imports of maize and soybeans, because it was supporting which had begun in the Marshall Plan, it was supporting the creation of an intensive livestock sector, which was the most dynamic sector of the US-centered food regime. So that system went into crisis in the early 1970s. And there was something, let's see if I put my slides in the order. Yes, I did. Okay. So that was a time, well, that was the time that the world food crisis was first defined as a food crisis. And along with, it went with the energy crisis, 1973-74. This is later, I'll get to that. And that was when the term food security was first introduced at the first World Food Summit in Rome in 1974, called by the US. What was meant by a food crisis? The price of wheat tripled. The price of other crops like maize also went way up, so that the price of meat went way up. Now, the whole experience of farmers who didn't like it, and of consumers who did, was that food was cheap, right? It was kept cheap through this direct shipment of aid and through the constant buying of the specific products by governments that produced these surpluses, and the surpluses kept pushing the prices down. Soviet Union in 1973 and 1974 bought massive amounts, and the price went way up. Now, there were other things that happened then, and you'll read about anchovies. If you look in this, you know, there were a lot of things that happened in that conjuncture. But the main thing is that the price, which had been the main feature of the regime, keeping it low, now was high and unstable, and even though it went up and down, it never went back to the old system. And that's what was meant by a food crisis. And the reason I put this slide here is this is from an article in Foreign Policy in 2015 by Olivier de Schutter, former special rapporteur on the right to food. And he's arguing, what this shows is that what we mean by food when we talk about a food crisis, again in 2007, 2008, is the prices go way up. Now it includes rice, a few other commodities, but only a few commodities, not the price of tomatoes, not the price of mangoes, not the price of spinach or lettuce or anything that we mean in this new sector of fresh fruits and vegetables. What we mean by a food crisis now is that the prices go way up of those products which are internationally traded and are speculated on. And by 2007, 2008, this had changed so much over the course of what I think is still a transition to some new system that isn't yet stable, but includes finance at the core of it, that they had created, the financial investors, the hedge funds and so on, had created what they called creative financial instruments that included commodity index funds, which in the name of reducing risk, in my view, increased it, but what they did was they combined lots of what are now called commodities. Tomatoes are not called commodities. Wheat is called a commodity, rice is called a commodity, soybeans, palm oil, some new things that are invested in by banks, hedge funds, speculators, and they are put in funds that combine minerals and energy. So, if the price of oil changes, suddenly everything in that basket changes too. So the price of food goes up, not because industrial agriculture is dependent on fossil fuels. It is. But that takes a while to work its way through the system, right? For the growers to buy more oil at a higher price. It was instantaneous. So the idea of combining, it's like mutual funds, the idea of combining different sectors in one speculative fund was to reduce the risk. You balance one thing against the other, but in fact, they drag it all in the same direction, especially oil. Oil does. So the price of food continues, and now what we have are just, there's a red one that's, I think, maize. No, the red one's wheat. The yellow one is, oh, those are the places. The green one, I think, is maize. It's the biggest one. So that's one point, and soy. So that's one point that I wanted to make. These are the directions of the main shipments. The second point I wanted to make is that when we think about migrant labor as belonging mainly to the fresh fruit and vegetable sector, which did grow up as a commercial sector and a transnational sector during this crisis, starting in the 1980s, that when we talk about that, we should not think about the other sectors, wheat and livestock, with livestock feeds, the grain livestock complex. We should not think of those as disappearing at all. What happens is they become incorporated into new relations, and during the transition, as we've learned from Giovanni Arrighi especially, the transition is orchestrated, it takes place through the control of finance relative to productive capital. Finance moves things around, and we're still in a financialized system, and that's why I'm reluctant to think that we've settled into a new food regime. We can look at many patterns that are changing, but many of them are moving in contradictory directions. So wheat remains in this chart. Livestock changes, it becomes polycentric, so that major shipments of soy now go to China, right? China's a new importer. The old complexes, like livestock, also become polycentric. So even starting in the 1990s, and Phil McMichael wrote some wonderful articles about the new livestock complex for elaborated products, for value-added, you might call them, products centered on Japan, so that an entire complex was set up in Thailand of intensive chicken production to produce yakitori, which was a new food, chicken on sticks, right, to go directly to China. So you got new complexes modeled on the US one, but now you don't have one system. You have multiple ways of doing this, multiple flows, multiple centers of production, multiple patterns of trade. So where does the fresh fruit and vegetable complex, which is the main place where citizenship is, I'm going to argue it isn't only the only place, but it's the main place we've seen citizenship being used to regulate migrant labor, especially state-to-state agreements or state-regulated private sector agreements. It's not clear what it means in relation to either finance, financial capital, or to our meaning of food in terms of these financially integrated products. In particular, within the manufacturing sector, and this may be one way that the crisis could be resolved, the manufacturing sector is reasserting itself against finance in several ways. One of them is the rise of supermarkets to relative power, so the retail sector relative to the manufacturing sector. In the US food regime, in the period from 1945 to 1973, the growth of the manufacturing sector was dominant. And so companies like Kraft in the US or Nestle, which was much older, colonial company, but they became really central, and that farmers were selling to them. This is how industrialization happened. Farmers were selling not to private consumers or even to a milling company that would sell me flour instead of processed wheat, but they were selling to manufacturing industries that were making more and more complicated, what I call durable foods, right? And that's where most farm products go now. They go even in these fresh fruit and vegetable, like tomatoes are on these big operations are rarely sold fresh. They go into processed foods. Right? And then they get more processed if they become part of a pizza or part of a frozen dinner, right? So this is becoming more and more elaborated. It began in the 1950s with the manufacturing industries beginning to buy more and more. And it began a lot with California, too, which was the pioneer of these migrant labor systems for fruits and vegetables. So the industrialization on the farm of tomatoes went with the industrialization of the final product. Right? Then you bought more tomato paste than you bought tomatoes. So now we have privately organized fresh fruit and vegetable sector that's transnational, that sometimes relies on migrant labor, that sometimes moves the capital, so from Spain to Morocco, and this is what you all know, right? I've been learning. So the capital can move, or it can move the labor, and that's where the field of study at that level happens, like what's happening to workers, what's happening to a particular sector. But what's happened in terms of food regime is two things. There's been a shift, again, of labor from agriculture, in terms of the amounts of labor, shift from agriculture to manufacturing and services. And that's where we have to also ask, is migrant labor important? Who's working in the food manufacturing industries? Who's working in the supermarkets? Who's working in the fast food and other rich restaurant sectors? And remember that we're talking about a food system, right? Not just agriculture. The second is that this thing that was agriculture, and statistics aren't being kept very much by governments anymore. It's complicated, but when they were, they mainly distinguished between the primary sector, which was agriculture, mining, a few things, manufacturing or secondary sector, and tertiary sector, which was services. Well, all of those don't work too well anymore, right? Especially with financialization and debt penetrating everything from labor to consumption and all of the capital in between. That in terms of food, the food system, what used to be an agricultural sector is now more and more precisely divided between the specific commodities. And I have to even be careful, the language keeps changing. I have to be careful even of using the term commodity here, because the term commodity used to mean anything that was bought and sold, right? Now, commodities are these things here, and they are distinguished from tomatoes and mangoes and lettuce, right? Which are not internationally traded in the same way. They might be through the supermarkets as processed foods, as durable foods. So, or sometimes lettuce can be made to last, can be quite durable. So, so migrant labor, let me switch now to migrant labor in Canada. So I'm going to pick up that thread of restriction of migration happening in Canada in order to assert national sovereignty and national security against the rights of empire, or the framework of empire, that privilege the freedom of anyone, of any individual to move. Okay. So now, though, after the rise of the US as the central power in the world and in the food regime, which I hope you agree, not too many people do, agriculture was the center of, right? Has been the center of those shifts of power and redefinitions from imperial bloc to national states and the national state system. That Canada, of course, took on a very different relation. It was always a secondary power in relation, not always actually, in relation to England. Actually, it was way more important to Britain after the US became independent. And it was a more important exporter in the 1900s and up through the 1930s than the US. The US became the dominant exporter. It's important not to make these things seem natural. The US was not naturally the dominant world exporter. In fact, in 1890, just to give you an example, the US Department of Agriculture looked at the major competitors for US wheat exports and was really concerned about India. Because India had been a settler, well, the Punjab, which is now Pakistan and Punjab province in India, that was also a settler state. It had, all along the Indus Valley, the British, when they finally pacified the border with Afghanistan, were able to bring settlers from other parts of India to settle and grow hard wheat in that climate and develop the port of Karachi, and off it would go to the UK. Similarly, wheat, a big competitor was Russia before the Russian Revolution, the Danube Basin. It was also settling Siberia, built the railway right across, just like the Americans did, just like the Canadians did, just like the Australians did, the Argentines, mostly British capital for all of them in that time. So these settler states were rivals, and within the imperial system of Britain, as it was transitioning, the US was not dominant at all. It became dominant through these practices after World War II, right? Especially food aid. So now, Canada then became a second power, second level exporter, one that could not afford those kinds of subsidies. Only Europe could in the 1950s and onward. But Canada copied the Bracero program from the US. So in 1964, it created the state-to-state relation, first with Mexico, and then first with Jamaica and other countries in the Caribbean, and then in 1975 with Mexico. It increased as a proportion of agricultural labor in the 1980s because fresh fruits and vegetables were growing there too. So what happened is, fresh fruits and vegetables had been marginal during the US food regime. They were in California, mainly. California invented many of the mechanisms. They were not central, but they grew up in the framework of excluding agriculture from the rules, the international trade rules, the labor rules. Then California became the model in the 1980s when fresh fruits and vegetables became important to capital and important to the reorganization of land, production, and labor. It became the model for places all over the world, not just in Europe, but also in Ontario, near Niagara Falls, my part of Canada, which has a and a little bit in British Columbia, which have the best climates for growing these things. Now we, of course, moved to greenhouses. It was really depressing seeing all of the plastic in the fields on the way down from Rome in the train. And we got them too, So if you drive across North America now, either in Canada or in the US, you'll see two things. You'll see maize and soybeans everywhere to feed the animals. Livestock has not gone away. And you will see plastic, right? Or glass, but plastic. And so this industrial transformation is not only about fruits and vegetables. So it's important to understand that the sectors have been differentiated, but that there's a general change of the old sectors. They don't go away, but they change to take the form dominated by the new sectors, and particularly now by finance capital. Now, here we have our Jamaican migrant labor in a greenhouse in Ontario. And here we have migrant labor inside the US in a meatpacking plant. So what started happening in the 1980s, part of the crisis of the food regime, part of a new transition, was that the meat packing industry became very concentrated financially and also geographically. There's only a handful now. I think last I looked it was 5 meatpacking plants serving the whole of North America. One of them is in Canada, in Alberta. And they moved. They didn't just, one took over from the others. The new one was in a completely new place, and they used immigrant workers. Usually legal immigrants, but now from Southeast Asia, from other countries in the US, mainly Hispanic. They broke the unions. During the US period, meatpacking was a very strong union. The meatpackers did well. It was a good job to have. I mean, it wasn't great work. You stood there, you know, in the cold and wet, cutting off one part of an animal that came your way. But it paid well. It was secure. It was a strong union. They broke the unions by simply moving, hiring immigrant workers, and only in a few places. And there's some studies that are amazing about the small, and I know I've read a few articles that you have similar situations here, but it was also happening in meatpacking. So small community in Kansas or Alberta will suddenly have all these culturally different people living there and working in this giant industry that wasn't there before. Okay. So a bunch of changes were happening, many changes were happening. I didn't have time this morning to find a picture, so I'm going to get to that in a minute. But supermarket employment and fast food employment is really important for the exploitation of labor, whether it's migrant labor, whether it's sans-papier, you know, undocumented labor, especially in the US, but also in Canada, anywhere. We have undocumented labor, very vulnerable, and it's reduced the conditions of work incredibly. So I don't know if you have this yet here, tell me, but we have, now it's incredible, it's very common in supermarkets to have on-call work, which means that if I get an agreement with an employer, one of the major supermarkets, to work there, I have to be available to work if they call me. If they don't, I still have to be available. If I'm not, they won't call me when they want. And it's incredibly vulnerable work. And of course, then citizens have to accept this as well, if that's the only work there is. But it's taken advantage of a lot of vulnerable workers for whatever reason. And that's what I'm suggesting here, is that the field of inquiry about migrant labor, about whether it's legal or not legal, whether it's state organized or organized by capital, should expand to the whole food system. And that we need to be able to think about agriculture as one part of a food system. That's the cumulative change. It's become ever more complex and ever more moved to the other parts. And I think that's important in rethinking how an alternative, what we call alternative, a better food system would be. A food system based on good work and good income for those who work in it. That we have to be able to think about a circular economy, about closing those links, not just in agriculture, but processing, retailing, domestic markets. All of this is happening. So I guess I'm suggesting a frame, maybe within food regimes, maybe just generally, a frame for rethinking the whole food system together, and putting together some of those pieces that people are experimenting with in all the ways. So I'm going to end with, well, I'll sort of end, almost end, with the resistance that raises the question of national borders again. So the big movements in Canada to try to support greater rights for contract workers, temporary workers, through these state-to-state relations, but also undocumented workers, anybody. One of the main groups is called No One is Illegal, right? And that's the idea, and it's for free movement of people. Now, that's very complicated. It's a hard thing to advocate unless you think it's not going to happen. But it's very interesting. And I think the way we can think our way into these questions of borders, migration, the use of citizenship to control and regulate labor is to think about this border question and what kinds of movements, what kinds of stability, what kinds of work could be possible. And now I'm going to suggest that in a settler colony where this question of national borders and state sovereignty emerged for the first time within the framework of empire, that we return to, because they're demanding it quite vociferously, we return to the question of indigenous people. I have these slides. Okay, this is a map of the border, part of the border between the United States and Canada. And the Great Lakes, the system of lakes here is one of the largest bodies of fresh water in the world. And this border is a red line that goes right through the middle of it. I remember when my daughter, who's now 32 and a professor of philosophy, when she was little, I was cooking dinner and she was looking at a globe and she ran her finger across this line. Over there it's straight, it's the 49th parallel, right? She ran her finger across it and she said, "Why is the border there, Mommy?" Oh! Well, there were wars and treaties and displacements and so on, but basically there's no good reason. I don't know how you tell somebody who's 6 years old about the Treaty of Westphalia, except I would have been wrong. That's what I've learned, that it wasn't about the Treaty of Westphalia. It was about wars between Britain and the US that became the first anti-colonial struggle, wars, the declaration of independence in a way, sovereignty by Canada within that framework, and the ability to control movements of people that relied on an earlier premise of having displaced the people who were there before. Okay, so the next thing, whoops, I lost my indigenous map. No, I lost my indigenous map. There is a map, this is a map of the Great Lakes from space, so if we want to think ecologically, right, we think that way. I have a map that I can look for on my computer, if you like, that shows the indigenous peoples who lived around the Great Lakes and who have never given up their claim to the right to live there and to use the land and the water and the forests, all of it, in ways that correspond to something cultural. Not the way they did before, but something quite different and something we might well pay attention to. There's now a quite interesting organization called the Great Lakes Commons, which is a space for cross-border collaboration about protecting the water. The term water protector has now become, in North America, an important term, important discourse, both for environmental movements and indigenous movements, and they're now quite allied. And that's what my last slide shows. I don't know if you've been following the news from Canada, but it's pretty hot right now. It's very interesting that indigenous people are leading a massive movement that is in play. It may work to end an oil pipeline from Alberta to the Pacific coast in order to supply oil to China, well, to Asia. There's stories. That's a whole story about why the Canadian government is insisting on it. But members of parliament have been arrested. Many people are being arrested. 200 leaders of the different indigenous nations in British Columbia alone, and of course the American Indians don't respect the border, nor did the Canadians during Standing Rock in the US. But they're now operating under a language of water protector, as they did at Standing Rock, and they are also allied with environmental movements very directly. So in this movement, they are building tiny houses with solar panels and ecological building all along the route of the pipeline. And so It's a very interesting, and it's very peaceful, but that doesn't mean people aren't getting arrested, of course. So I just want to raise, in a settler context, I have no idea what the relation is here, but in a settler context where, if it's true that this idea of national sovereignty, that as a way of controlling movement and regulating labor, came out of this settler context, that maybe it's interesting to include in our thinking about future and borders and labor, that we think about this crazy recent border that is now being challenged in a variety of ways and led by Indigenous people. So, thank you.